it's good to be on something that's not going to hold me. All right. It's good to be back on Route 66. And it's fun to watch the trains go by, too. But it's especially good to be here. I passed the Red Cedar Inn 200 times, probably. Driving or riding the Frisco back in the day, or the Missouri Pacific Amtrak. And I took a lot of photographs of the building's beautiful red cedar log exterior, but I never walked inside. This is the first time I've ever been inside this building. So, I mean, these knotty pine interior walls harken back to the charm you don't get in fast food stops along the interstate. If these walls could talk, they would tell better stories than mine, but you'll just have to put up with that. So, we did have early dinner at the Opera House, or the Opera House. Yeah, and it was really nice. I remember Jim McHugh Sr. I knew Jim McHugh Jr. as well, but Jim McHugh Sr. had invited me. This was when I was director of tourism for the state, and Jim McHugh Sr. had invited me to come and take a look at the Opera House, and it was before it was finished. They had just bought the building, or had owned it, I guess, for a while, and decided that they were going to try to refurbish it. But I got a chance to look at everything before they had fixed it. And so to come back today, even though I found out that Jim McHugh died just a little while back, so but he lived to be 97 years old, so we all can only hope to do that. You know, millions of people visit Six Flags, and that's great. I just wish more of them knew about the great natural attractions along the Henry Shaw Ozark corridor, and you guys know about these, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's a patchwork quilt of more than 24 protected areas, including city and county and state parks, and 8 conservation areas, including the Pacific Palisades and one of my favorite rivers, the Meramec, and I would imagine yours as well. It all started just up the road when the Missouri Botanical Garden established Shaw Nature Reserve back in the Roaring 20s, because the city air was killing the orchids. So they brought the orchids out here, upwind, and the orchids love it, which is pretty cool. Route 66 State Park, Steiny's Roadhouse, where you can get a great meal and have a good time, or you used to. I've spent quality time at Lone Elk Park and listened to the howls at the Endangered Wolf Sanctuary, and this is from my first book, which you bought. Not a mile from the wolves as the crow flies, Rio slept through high-flying dreams. Rio is a retired actor who grew up performing at Reptile Gardens in Florida. When he arrived at the World Bird Sanctuary, his rap sheet said he was territorial and an unreliable flyer. But the folks at the sanctuary saw promise in this bright red macaw with stunning blue and green trim. Now this talkative teen lives here with Nemo and Guapo and the other parrots, not to mention owls and eagles and the world's fastest animal, a peregrine falcon. It's no accident the World Bird Sanctuary sits so close to the Endangered Wolf Center. This bird haven was hatched in 1977 by ornithologist Walter C. Crawford, who worked with Marlin Perkins. Crawford recognized a need to care for birds of prey, especially injured raptors and exotic birds illegally smuggled into the United States. His hospital takes patients with broken wings and aviary ailments, but the worst malady suffered by incoming patients is neglect. The Parrot Rehab and Placement Program has successfully relocated hundreds of birds, including abandoned parrots who outlived their welcome or outlived their owners. Parrots live a long time, and they remember things. Standing next to these amazing birds is the closest I've come to a pet who can pronounce my name. Up close, I saw eagles and owls who survived gunshot wounds and red-tailed hawks who survived tangles with cars. Bad cars. It was on the Meramec River that I learned that mussels are smarter than smallmouth bass. Organizers had invited a group of reporters to examine the river up close, over 60 miles in 6 days. It was a journey of discovery that turned into a biology class. First thing I learned were the names. There are butterfly mussels and three-ridge mussels and round pigtoe mussels and pimplebacks and spectacle cases and ladyfingers and pink heel splitters. Next thing I learned is that these animals move around using their feet. Feet. Well, foot. They may not be fast, but they're smart. The female pocketbook mussel has been fooling smallmouth bass for longer than there have been fishermen. She produces thousands of glaucidia, tiny mussel babies, in a sac she holds inside her shell, and she waits for the right time to release them into the world. Well, she doesn't really wait. She waves. She sticks her fleshy foot out of the opening in her shell and waves it tantalizingly like a kerchief, except that this foot looks exactly like a minnow. Its outline is in the shape of a minnow. It even has a dark dot for a fake eye. It's enough to fool a smallmouth bass, and the fish tries to eat the fake minnow. When the fish bites, the mussel expels 1,000 babies into the fish's mouth, and the babies hook onto the gills of the startled bass. The bass becomes a host, with baby mussels hanging on and growing for about 10 days, until they're strong enough to drop to the bottom of the riverbed and fend for themselves. The whole process doesn't hurt the bass, and if he's annoyed that he didn't get the fake minnow, it doesn't stop him from trying again the next time. All right, let's get to the point here. According to Tom Wolfe, by the way, these pictures have nothing to do with my presentation. They're just up there so if you get tired of looking at me or listening to me, you watch them. But they are pictures that I've taken over my travels throughout Missouri. According to Tom Wolfe and the residents of both coasts, you live in the Great Flyover. It's hard to find anybody who gives two hoots about what happens here. But that's only because of ignorance, and I'll demonstrate what I mean. 2 decades ago, I was in London on the BBC promoting Missouri. I was working with the Division of Tourism for Missouri. It was July 4th, an odd day to be promoting America in London, but they were cordial and greeted me with Happy 4th of July, John. Happy 4th of July to you too, London. People in London aren't really familiar with Missouri, so here's how I introduced us to them. A London newspaper had recently asked their readers one simple question. Who is your favorite American? The top 4 vote getters were Mark Twain, Jesse James, Harry Truman, and Mickey Mouse. That's what you call a grand slam, and I had to explain that to our good British friends. Here's another example of the Great Flyover. It was a cold January day, and I was beating the pavement in Manhattan talking to magazine editors to promote Missouri. One crusty editor of a magazine that shall go nameless except to say that it was national in scope and geographic in nature, he really wasn't interested, and he said, why would my readers want to come to Missouri? And so I started telling him about Route 66, and I told him about the Ozark Trail. I told him about Smash Rock and Devil's Well and Slaughter Sink. And pretty soon he had a map that I had brought out, and he was designing his trip that he was going to take to Missouri. So far so good. Well, 2 weeks later he was transferred to another magazine, and his trip never happened. So sometimes you take one step forward, you know the rest. So why would some idiot drive every mile of every road in Missouri? One word: stories. There are 350 million reasons why Americans travel, but one common thread runs through every traveler: stories. Human beings everywhere relate through stories. Every religion, every nation, every state, every county and town, every family tells their stories. You don't want to come home from a trip to your friends and family and ask, well, what'd you do on your vacation? Not much. Tell the stories. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I was going to drive every mile of every road on the Missouri Highway map. But I thought I'd been a lot of places, so I got out a map and traced the places that I knew I had been, and I was honest with myself about it, at least what I could remember. And this is back in the mid-'80s, basically, and this is upside down, of course. And this is what I had done. Mainly interstates, main roads, a few capillaries, but not much more than that. And don't mind the shaking, it's essential tremors. It won't kill me, but it will just aggravate you. Anyway, this is where I started from, knowing that I had done those roads, and believe me, I drove over those roads probably 1,000 times trying to get to the ones that I had not driven. We'll get into that. So filling out the map became an obsession, and you know, we all know people who have obsessions, OCD. None of us do, but we know people who do. And, I didn't recognize it as an obsession at first, but it grew and gnawed and became the elephant in my room. My car and I think you've seen pictures of the car by now, we drove more miles than Columbus and Magellan, Marco Polo, Lewis and Clark, and Dr. Livingstone combined. The only difference between those intrepid explorers and us, the explorers' feats of bravery changed the world. We just drove around a lot. The project, as it evolved, took 13 years. And it was pretty much my car and I, nobody else. Cheryl, who's sitting back there with her best friend Wendy, had little faith in my aimless sojourns. She learned by experience. One weekend, many years ago, we were headed to a wedding in Perry County. She pleaded with me not to take any back roads. Let's get to the wedding on time. I told her I could take a couple of back roads along the way and reassured her that we would get to the wedding on time. Well, we were late, and I consider myself lucky to be alive today and talking to you. Yes, yeah, you would have gotten us there an hour early. Absolutely. She drove us on to our wedding, and actually from our wedding, I think, too. The scariest ride in my life. But she's a good driver. So on most of my travels, it was just my car and me. My car became my research assistant, my trigger, my lassie, my Rin Tin Tin, all rolled into one. And she became something else, a rider's device. Her name is Arifnus Catenop, a name that occurred to me as I scrambled to get out of the way of an emergency vehicle coming up behind me. I read the words backwards in my rearview mirror. It said ambulance. And it occurred to me that that could be the name of my car. Arifnus Catenop is nothing more than Pontiac Sunfire spelled backwards. So there you go. Along the way, Arifnus, Cape Nop, and I drove a lot of back and forth, a lot of redundancy just to reach fresh, untraveled pavement. You know, I admire so much the great road trippers. Homer started it all, but John Steinbeck and Jack Kerouac, William Least Heat Moon, who actually lives in Columbia, Missouri, Bill Trogdon, he wrote Blue Highways, and it's pretty humbling to live in the same town as somebody who wrote such a seminal piece. But their journeys were linear, more or less, from point A to point B. Mine wasn't so much a trip from point A to point B. It was more like mowing a 68,000 square mile lawn. So how in the world could I get my arms around a trip like that? Early on, an editor gave me some valuable advice. Nobody wants to wade through 700 Missouri towns just to hear their town's name. Tell the stories. So after 250,000 miles of hands-on research in diners and dives and dead ends, graveyards and courthouses and museums, more diners, more graveyards, and a surprising number of open doors, I wrote a book. Now a series of 3 books, and I brought a few copies here if you're interested. Okay, so this is my map. This is what it looks like after you complete driving every mile of every road on this highway map. It's put together with tape, as you can see, and this is actually the 5th incarnation of the maps. They all obviously rode shotgun with me and had to suffer the indignity of coffee spills and roll down windows and water stains and whatnot. So I would dutifully draft from one to the next just to make sure that I got all these roads correctly. And I could be lying to you. Maybe I didn't do all of these roads, but I'm here to say that even when I came up to a bridge that was closed because of maintenance, I would drive all the way around connecting roads to find that blacktop on the other side, or whatever highway it was, to finish driving that particular road, just so I knew I could mark it off my map. So people ask me, why don't you put it in Ripley's Believe It or Not, or something like that, but you've got to prove that you did it, and the final proof is what I'm telling you. So anyway, along my journey, I filled 40 steno notebooks like this, and I never drank while I drove. I never texted while I drove, which I think is really the major scourge right now on the roads, and the main reason I wouldn't repeat this whole journey. But I do apologize to the oncoming cars that I scared when I threw this over the steering wheel, and at 60 miles an hour I was riding down what I had just seen. And it's kind of interesting. My car likes to go fast, Wendy. I have to tell my car to slow down, and I had to tell at least a half a dozen state troopers that when I was stopped, and they would ask me, do I know why they stopped me? And of course I would say, yes, my car likes to go fast. And they would chuckle as they wrote out a ticket, and I was on my way. I must say that the Missouri State Highway Patrol is the most professional bunch of state troopers I've ever encountered. but anyway, I noted a lot of stories along the way, and a lot of people who should be in the Hall of Famous Missourians, and I'll just tick off a few just because you know them. Carl Stalling. Ever heard of Carl Stalling? You know Carl Stalling. He's called the Dean of Tunes. As a kid, he was a really good piano player in Lexington, Missouri, and it was at the time of silent movies, and so he was the music behind the silent movies. He was so good that he gravitated to Kansas City and played in the movie houses there, and a young film director from Laugh-O-Gram Studios saw him, discovered him, and hired him to work with Walt Disney, and they produced Steamboat Willie and a bunch of other things, then gravitated to California. And Carl Stalling worked with Walt Disney for, a few years, and then he quit. And people thought he was nuts. They said, what in the world, why are you quitting Disney? But he got a better offer. He went to Warner Brothers Studio, and they were just starting a new series of cartoons called Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes. And he was the music director for the Warner Brothers cartoons. Bugs Bunny and Kill the Wabbit. Next time you're out in your front yard and your neighbor is washing the car and they're singing Kill the Wabbit, they learned that from Carl Stalling, not from the classics. So anyway, Ukulele Ike. You ever heard of Ukulele Ike? Okay, well, he's from Hannibal, Missouri. He grew up in Hannibal and obviously played the ukulele, was a songwriter and kind of a troubadour who eventually gravitated to Hollywood and met with quite a bit of success before the wheels came off and he had some trouble in his late life. But during his heyday, he wrote and sang a song that you're pretty familiar with, I'm sure. It's in the movie Pinocchio, and it's When You Wish Upon a Star. That is Ukulele Ike. So anyway, he grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and it's understandable that in Hannibal, Ukulele Ike doesn't get much billing. There's somebody else that takes all the air out of the room in Hannibal, and that's understandable. And I must mention, especially because these two ladies are sitting on the back row, our dear departed Yogi Berra. Yogi and I have one thing in common. We both married ladies from Salem, Missouri. So Yogi and I spent time on the Salem golf course, ate lunch at the Tower Inn, never together, of course. I'd never met Yogi, but I heard the stories, and he was around. Actually, I write about many of the places that I frequented in my books, and I even found the best place to watch the tango, believe it or not. And this is what makes the journey so much fun. It was 13 years and 250,000 miles, but you just never know what you're going to see around the next bend. And it was a Saturday morning. I was driving back from southwest Missouri, probably Branson or thereabouts, and was on Highway 60 coming towards Springfield when I came into Mount Vernon, Missouri. This is Saturday morning, 11 o'clock maybe, and I, on the town square, ran into the Mount Vernon Tango Festival, which was amazing. First of all, the dancers are so beautiful in the dance itself, but the music was really wonderful as well. And you know, once again, it was just an accident that I saw that. But now, and I researched it, the Mount Vernon Tango Festival had been going on for a long time and still is, as far as I know. So we took the long way around the state. Along the way, we dodged rabbits and turtles, texters and drunks. We've slid sideways in sleet, jumped curbs and low water crossings. We've passed every pun on every roadside marquee, every time and temperature sign, every clip joint and carny barker and corn dog vendor, every barbecue shack and Tex-Mex taco stand. And we've stopped at most of them. And cemeteries. So I'll tell one cemetery story. During my travels, Dad worried about me. I can still hear his voice. John, you can do more things that don't make money. But he also told me valuable stories. In Dad's hometown of Hannibal, Joe Douglas is the town's second favorite son. Sam Clemens, of course, is the town's first favorite son. You know him as Mark Twain. He isn't buried among the 15,000 headstones at Mount Olivet Cemetery, but his mom and dad are, and most of the rest of his Hannibal family. And so is Injun Joe, or more precisely, the man Hannibalians think served as Twain's model for Injun Joe. Joe Douglas was a decent man, and his life was pretty good, except for his reputation as the model for a raging, bloody, cutthroat killer. Even in his later years, bathing in the spotlight of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, Twain never fingered Joe Douglas as the model for Injun Joe. He remained mum on the subject, carrying his thoughts to his grave 1,000 miles away from Hannibal. A century after Twain's death, his autobiography finally sees the light of day, and Twain says that Injun Joe was patterned on somebody else. But the folks of Hannibal hold tight to their own beliefs about Mark Twain. There were 19,000 people in Hannibal at the time Twain sat on his porch in Hartford, Connecticut, and wrote about Injun Joe, and almost all of them were convinced that Joe Douglas served as Twain's model. Through no fault of his own, Joe Douglas had the physical characteristics to play Injun Joe. He was a towering figure of Osage Indian and African descent, with deep facial scars from smallpox and a red wig hiding a bald head. Dad knew Joe Douglas. They met when Dad was 7 years old and Joe was 102. Dad said he used to come into the service station where I washed windshields as a kid. Even as an old man, every Saturday Injun Joe would ride into Hannibal from his home outside Spalding in the back seat of a car driven by a neighbor family. They would buy some gasoline and sell some produce, and Injun Joe would laugh and joke with us kids, but nobody ever called him Injun Joe or even brought up the subject. We were respectful of him, or maybe just afraid. So I set out to find Joe Douglas. As a boy, Sam Clemens prepared for his adult career by hiding. Mark Twain Cave is where he did some of his best hiding, and as anybody who was a school kid knows, of course, when Twain was a schoolboy, it wasn't called Mark Twain Cave because he wasn't called Mark Twain. It was called McDowell's Cave, named for the doctor who owned it. In his novels, Twain called it McDougal's Cave, which later was renamed Mark Twain Cave for the obvious reasons of honor and tourism. In Twain's tale, Injun Joe dies. Twain makes the scene dark and devilish. His villain dies at a manhole-sized back entrance to the cave, where searchers find Joe's dead eyes shining out of the darkness, the bony fingers of his corpse clutching the iron bars that blocked his escape. As Twain transformed his experience along these bluffs into a collective of the world's greatest adventures, his silence about Joe Douglas created one more tragedy. The proof lies in Mount Olivet Cemetery. Like most old cemeteries, Mount Olivet hides plenty of forgotten history beneath a stonecutter's art gallery. It sprouts plenty of character. The most noticeable sprout is a 10-foot tall tombstone chiseled in the image of a tree trunk. Less flamboyant is the simple military marker for the admiral of the Great White Fleet. Nearby lie the bones of a guy who couldn't afford a lawyer. His Supreme Court case paved the way for suspects without money to get counsel. But I hadn't intended to get caught up in graveyard biographies. I was seeking the tragedy that Twain had allowed to happen, the branding of the real Joe Douglas as the fictional Injun Joe. To his dying day, Joe denied that he was the Injun Joe in Twain's tale, but the descendants of Mark Twain's Hannibal can't let go. They erected a headstone on his grave a few years ago, and I found it in Mount Olivet Cemetery. It said, Joe Douglas, known to many in Hannibal as Injun Joe, died September 29, 1923, at age 102. He was found, an infant, in an abandoned Indian camp by a man named Douglas who raised him. He denied that he was the Injun Joe in Mark Twain's writings, as he had always lived an honorable life. Joe Douglas met a tragic end of his own. He died of apparent ptomaine poisoning after eating pickled pig's feet. Old legends die hard. All right, now I can't get out of here without telling a story about trains. Are you all you're from Eureka and Pacific?
Kansas City.
Kansas City, all right. You're the odd one out. Well, you got here on Mopac then. This is about the Frisco. I grew up in Rolla, and about 2 blocks from the railroad tracks. And so when I was very small, the engines were still mostly steam, but it was transitioning very fast. But this is a story about taking the train to St. Louis. Even though I couldn't tell time, I knew it was early. 3 a.m., my mother told me. Time to get up. We jumped into our traveling clothes, grabbed our suitcases, and hurried out the door into darkness, stumbling down the hill to the tracks that led to the railroad station. A distant engine faded in and out of my hearing, gradually growing louder as it chugged up the long hill toward Rolla. Just beyond the curve, a mile down the tracks, a light beam bounced back and forth through the bare trees, shot from the revolving beacon of the nose of the Texas Special. Full of sound and fury, the big red and silver engine rounded the curve, wagged its beacon at us, and chugged and hissed mightily as it swept into the Rolla depot. We climbed aboard the 5th car back, behind the mail car and the baggage car, and breathed that intoxicating aerosol cocktail of axle grease and diesel fuel. Too excited to sleep, I pressed my nose against the picture window as scenic shadows rolled by, framed by the faint rose precursor to the dawn. In the early daylight, we pinballed up the aisle to a breakfast table in the dining car, where my nose pressed against another giant picture window. I anticipated the red flashing lights of the railroad crossings as they whizzed past, bells clanging, car headlights stacked a dozen deep behind the barriers. At the dining car's breakfast table, fresh cut flowers sprouted from vases atop linen tablecloths. Real silver served up the best fare this side of the Savoy. The attention to detail befits royalty. In movies and mysteries and in my memory, the railroad dining car is the centerpiece to nostalgia. Fully fed, we returned to our seats. The scenery was transforming from countryscape to city grid as we approached our ultimate goal, Union Station in downtown St. Louis. As a kid, along with my family on a shopping trip, I couldn't wait to get to Sticks, Bear and Fuller and Scruggs, Vandervoort and Barney and Famous Bar. Mom trusted me. She knew I would head straight to the floors where they sold books and toys and books. I read them all. Lunchtime meant an a la carte adventure through the line at Pope's Cafeteria or Miss Hulling's or the Forum Cafeteria, where awaiting on a bed of crushed ice were 100 tiny porcelain dishes of red or green or golden jello, each with its white cap of whipped cream. Even though I went through a cafeteria line every weekday at school, this cafeteria was different. Choices, meatloaf and fish and chicken pot pie, gravies and soups, stewed tomatoes and broccoli casserole and German chocolate cake. Then more shopping, more books big as life with pictures and stories. By the time we hit the bunk beds at the old Mayfair Hotel, sleep was the only option. Today, lots of things have changed. The department stores have all but vanished. Specialty shops have squeezed into Union Station, occupying spaces vacated by the Pullman sleepers and club cars at the Frisco and the Wabash and the Missouri Pacific. And passenger trains don't go through Raleigh anymore, but I'm grateful because that's where I got the travel bug. Or maybe it was this. It was one of my first memories of Hannibal. Mark Twain had been dead for 40 years. I had been alive for 4. From behind the front seat of our 49 Chevrolet, my heart jumped, feeling my father edge our old sedan closer to the Mississippi, that giant river whose black waters blended into the dark night sky. Inching down the cobblestone bank that has been Hannibal's welcome mat for 2 centuries, we parked among 100 other cars. Together we sat bathed in the popcorn glow of 1,000 yellow lights outlining the decks of the Delta Queen. The Queen filled our windshield picture, wider than the eyes of a 4-year-old. In an instant, steam the color of Sam Clemens' hair began belching from a topside calliope, its maestro tapping out the familiar syncopation of Down Yonder. As the calliope's As the Calliope's last throaty steam whistles echoed back across the black water, applause burst forth in a most unique manner. Horns honking and lights flashing, the cars came alive in their enthusiastic approval of a sound, a style, and a mode of travel that the internal combustion engine had driven to the edge of extinction. But not quite. The Delta Queen was still the grande dame of the rivers. A few years back, our family rode the Delta Queen from St. Paul to St. Louis, a voyage of 7 days with stops in a half-dozen river towns along the way. When Cheryl and I first stepped aboard, we lowered the average age of passengers to 85. It's too bad that young travelers have no patience for Victorian pace, no taste for Gilded Age grandeur. With a passenger-to-crew ratio of 2 to 1, we were never more than an arm's length from superb service. On the day we steamed into Hannibal, passengers went ashore to scour the town, whitewash a fence, get lost in a cave, and generally relive childhood adventures. As the time to depart Hannibal grew near, Cheryl and I sat in our stateroom balcony reading. For half an hour, the Delta Queen's whistle had blasted steam signals, calling passengers to get back aboard the boat. The last throaty whistle echoed between the bluffs as I looked up to see a lady charge down the hill toward the steamer, arms loaded with packages, nearly out of control. The lady's family and friends shrieked and waved frantically from the Texas deck, hoping the pilot would wait for her to board. "Cast off all lines," came the call. Surely the captain wouldn't penalize her for having too much fun retracing the trails of Tom Sawyer. With cinematic flair and no time to spare, she leaped upon the stage. landlubbers call it a gangplank. And the Delta Queen shoved off, setting a course downriver to St. Louis. From the cozy comfort of our stateroom veranda, we heard the calliope hiss and spit a chorus of Down Yonder, and watched townspeople trade farewell salutes with riverboat passengers. We raised our wine glasses to the town as it grew tiny in the wake of the churning stern wheel. You know, if you have questions or stories or want to interject, just feel free. I enjoy learning stories from you all as much as telling them. But I will tell one more here. This is about the Ozarks. It's called Missouri's Wild Belly. Far back as I can remember, float trips on Ozark streams ended with me riding back home, asleep in the back seat. Not this time. After dinner at Jason's Pavilion, I set my sights on driving 100 miles west, as the crow flies, to Branson. Only one problem. From these razorback ridges and deep ravines, there's no direct path to Branson or anywhere. On my highway map, I found my current location, halfway between Salem and Eminence, and a half inch to the west, at the confluence of several routes that begin and end with K. On the map, there is no straight line to Branson. If I wanted to stay on paved roads, the route would require backtracking on an alphabet soup of blacktops and highways, first going in the opposite direction, then south in a sweeping circle that finally turns west toward Branson. Hours of extra driving. What would Magellan do? I mumbled to myself. Magellan and I are kindred spirits. We both let Columbus go first and do the dirty work, testing the edge of the world and battling sea serpents and scary stuff like that. Magellan and I both like to travel, except that I have better maps and don't have a penguin named after me, or that most treacherous strait on the face of the earth, for that matter. And I wasn't murdered on my journey either, not yet anyway. Other than that, well, we both put a lot of miles behind us. Oh, and we both had a penchant for finding a new way from point A to point B. Seeing no direct route from here to Branson, I channeled the ghost of Magellan, and I asked directions. Got a shortcut from here to Branson? I asked Gene Maggard. Yep, he said. His directions were sure as sundown and not all that complicated, really. But the shortcut used every kind of back road I'd ever imagined. Blacktop, gravel, dirt, low-water ford over the river, and a right turn at a one-room schoolhouse. That much would get me across the river and point me to Raymondville and save an hour. But watch for deer, Gene cautioned. They're thick, especially at dusk. The deer own this part of the Ozarks with its dense forest draped over steep valleys. I thanked Gene and started my journey along the narrowest ridge used for a Missouri highway. The ridge's name? Devil's Backbone, of course. It was 9 p.m. in the middle of the summer. With a quick check of the gas gauge and a kick of my tire with a slow leak, I took off toward the sun, which was burning the treetops along the horizon. First mile of blacktop, 3 deer darted across the road. A dozen deer later, deep into the woods, I adopted a tactic most similar to the Indiana bat. Every 15 seconds, a beep from my car horn bounced off anything with ears. Hopefully the deer would realize that a car was barreling through at upwards of 30 miles an hour. Don't know if my sonar worked. Didn't see any more deer though, and none of the sparsely scattered neighbors called the sheriff about excess noise pollution. It was a beautiful drive to Branson, I know it was, even in the dark. Not so much because of the time I'd saved, but because I took a shortcut across Missouri's wild belly. You know, all of these places form the fabric of the stories about Missouri, and we all have those stories. my only request to you is that pass on that history. Pass on those stories that you know. Pass them on to your children, your grandchildren, your neighbors. And you know, we've got a holiday coming up and another one after that. And when we gather with relatives, there's a pretty good chance that the young relatives are going to have their cell phones, and that's what they're paying attention to, right? So just ask them if they'd be interested in recording a story. Have your story ready, and see if whether it's a video or just an audio, and pass on those stories. Not even so much your stories, but the stories your parents told you and your grandparents told you. Because if you're like me, most of those stories are up here, and once we're gone, they're gone. So it would just it would be nice to do that for your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, if nothing else. But because at the end of the day, we are a community of stories. And I thank you all very much for your patience and for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon. Maundy, Thursday, and I didn't realize that. So we'll blame that. But thank you for everybody. Any questions or stories or comments?
If you were talking to Gene, if you were on K, did he tell you the K?
Yeah.
If you'd have done K about 4 or 5 hours later, after 9, you probably would have run into one of the run runners, or one of the
Yeah.
shine runners.
Yeah.
I used to run into them all the time.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I'm sure they're still down there because they don't want to pay the taxes on the hooch. But yeah.
Back then, if you saw a 65 Ford Galaxy coming up on you, that was a shine runner.
Ah, all right. Are you from that area?
No, we had a place, my grandparents,
Ah, excellent. So you knew Gene?
out of Hartshorn,
Yeah.
which is just outside of Summersville.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just got off the Jack's Fork. We were supposed to go 2 weeks ago, but that didn't happen.
River's been closed, most of the river's been closed.
Oh, yeah.
Now either.
No.
Yeah. Well, you know, last week there was a lot of brush, you know, and a lot of root wads around the bends, but the water was up, and so you could make the trip pretty fast as long as you were careful. And, you know, I'm old enough that I'm not proud. If I see something that looks dangerous, I'll get to the beach and walk my canoe around. There's no question about that. You know, Gene passed away.
Yeah, and his son
And his
passed away
son.
right after he did.
Yes, yeah, Marcus. Yeah, that was sad. That was sad to lose. And of course, Eleanor before that.
Yeah, I haven't been down there in 30 years, 40 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, you know,
I
it's,
grew up on the current, so
yeah.
I used to guide on it when I was a kid.
Well, it's, you know, it's changed, but it hasn't changed, obviously. There's a lot more people.
I was gonna say, I wouldn't go down there nowadays.
Well, the current
I'm on
especially.
a couple of the Facebook, Current River and National
Yeah.
Scenic Riverways
Yeah.
groups, and just a number of people down there.
Oh, yeah. It's, you know, when I was director of tourism, somebody asked me one time, he said, what, you know, don't you worry about inviting so many people to these areas that are pristine and really can't handle that kind of traffic? And that was a tremendous question, and of course I'm promoting tourism throughout the state, but I said, you know, if we don't protect what we have, it's not going to be worth seeing.
Well, the last time I was on the river was probably 20 years ago, and there's just so much foam on the river and everything.
There's, you can see, well, and the canary in the coal mine were the hellbenders. And when the hellbenders weren't having babies,
They cut down so much there's so much timber's been cut down.
Yeah, you know, I think they're still doing some clear cutting, but most of the timber management, I think, has maybe isn't what it was 20 years ago.
Yeah,
Because they were clear cutting just,
It's all on rural earth, and I just,
yeah,
you didn't see
Oh, yeah.
those big patches like that.
yeah,
Now there's a lot of cattle farms down there.
oh, yeah.
They're running, you know, they clear them out and all the cattle farms are running, but back then, it's,
Well, you know, in the, before the Civil War, and even after the Civil War, there was, I'll probably not get these numbers right because they're off the top of my head, but 13 million acres of prairie in Missouri.
yeah,
And now it's down to a few
those are railroad ties.
managed prairies. Well, yeah. Yeah, they clear cut the entire Ozarks to build the railroads, and then settled the Irish in the Ozarks, the Irish and the Scotch who helped build the railroads. But yeah, at Devil's Elbow, Missouri, which is on the Big Piney River, there's a turn. The reason it's called Devil's Elbow is when they were clear cutting the logs around the turn of the century or slightly before that, and they were running these big giant rafts of logs down the river. The logs would get hung up in that bend, and they had a dickens of a time moving it, so that became known as Devil's Elbow. But yeah, they cleared it out, and obviously the karst topography and the rocky soil and whatnot, all of those rocks broke up, and so much of it ended up in the stream beds. But that's what makes those stream beds unique now. You know, it's and now the deer are back, and we even have elk. And people were worried about introducing the elk to the Ozarks. You know, and I can understand the fear. If you run into a deer, that's a big deal. If you run into an elk, that's death. You
All
know?
down there, it's not a case of if, it's when.
Well, but the elk, this is what I've been told, I don't know if it's actually true or not, but the elk are actually a little more wary and a little more clued into when people or cars or traffic or whatever are around, and so they'll generally stay out of the way of traffic, which is a good thing.